Hopefully this will work. Okay, so I am now a full-time employee of Boehringer Ingelheim. That's obviously a conflict of interest, although I'll tell you a bit about what we do, and you know, I don't think I'm going to be talking about anything that will be too controversial in that sense today. So I thought I'd better start. I always overthink things, so I started to think, okay, I've got to give this talk about emotions, and I started to think, what the hell is an emotion? So I thought I'd better start with some sort of definitions, and I kind of stole this. We've already heard quite a lot from other people about these kinds of issues earlier. This is sort of modeled after Damasio, because there are different components to what we would call broadly emotional processing. So here I'm defining emotions as the very in the moment thing. They're normally accompanied by a physiological response, be that something happening in the gut, or a skin conductance response, which we've heard about, and they're very short term, happening really very in the moment. I guess the next stage of these would be feelings, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a minute, because we have an emotional response to things, but then the context in which we're operating determines how we feel about that. So if I am suddenly confronted with an axe murderer, if I'm in the cinema watching a horror movie, that's fine. If I'm in my lounge, that's not so good. So, we have to interpret emotions in the context of the environment in which we find ourselves. And then ultimately over time, these will translate into what we sort of nebulously call mood. That is sort of how we're feeling on average over maybe a couple of hours or a couple of days, this sort of wider context. And I'm going to start by giving you some examples of changes in these different three sort of parts of the emotional processing cascade in different types of mental health conditions. I'm then going to think about, okay, we have these observations, we understand quite a lot about neuroscience. What can we do with that information to actually improve patients' lives, which is what my interest is and has always been. So an example around anxiety to start with. We've heard, all emotions are there for a reason. Anxiety is really, really important for telling us about threats in the world that we might want to pay attention to. So if you're out there walking, maybe not in the UK so much, but certainly in Canada, maybe in Italy and parts of Western Europe, you may encounter a bear. And if you see a bear with their cubs, they're going to be particularly, vigilant. And so this is a bear that you might want to pay attention to if you encounter it. That this bear is probably going to be fine, right? It's really hard to think how that could harm you. And so we know that sensitivity to negative emotions plays quite a significant component in anxiety disorders and the underlying neurobiology. So patients have been observed to have exaggerated sort of arousal responses, so things like the skin conductance response. They're hypervigilant to threat in the environment, so they're much more sensitive to what could be dangerous, even in settings where that may or may not be important. They also can be biased towards processing negative information, and this is something I'll come back to a little bit later. So when you have an ambiguous situation, so maybe you're out walking and you see your friend on the street and they just walk right past you, there's many ways you can interpret that, right? Maybe they just didn't see you, maybe you've upset them, and there's some evidence that patients with anxiety and other mood disorders tend to, on average, perceive the negative potential interpretation of these ambiguous events. And also, it's been shown in kind of fear conditioning type studies that patients with this kind of diagnosis extinguish negative things more slowly. So they learn more slowly that something is not dangerous anymore. So what does this mean in the brain? I mean, there's obviously a lot going on here, and we've just heard you have to be super cautious about how you kind of construct these models around what is going on in a human, a complex human, based on what's going on in their brain. But I think a common theme here is that regulating emotions is, to a certain extent, a top-down thing. It's something that we learn about the world, and that learning and that weight of history causes us to interpret our emotions in different ways. And so there's decent evidence from neuroimaging literature, for example, that patients with certain sorts of mood disorder and anxiety can show sort of exaggerated response to negative stimuli, emotional stimuli, particularly in the amygdala compared to healthy controls. And this seems to be related to negative bias. So in terms of feelings, I wanted to focus on schizophrenia. Now, people, when they think of schizophrenia, tend to think about what we would call the positive symptoms, psychosis. So these are sort of hearing voices, having odd ideas about the world. But this is just part of the symptom profile that these patients experience. They also experience impairments in cognition as well as a nebulous cluster of symptoms called negative symptoms. So these are changes in social behaviour, changes in motivational state, and so on. So one of the key factors of the negative symptoms is sort of blunted emotional responses, also sometimes called anhedonia, although as I'll talk about later, that's a really messy term, and that's something we're kind of interested in kind of pinning down a little bit more at the moment. And so people who experience this condition just don't seem to be as bothered by things in the world as they might be. So it's almost like their emotions are happening, but they're sort of interpreting them in a way like, okay, well, why should I care about this? And there's some evidence that this might be related to reward processing, as you might expect, and that there are changes in learning about reward in this condition. Another key symptom domain within the negative symptoms in patients is changes in social behaviour. So there's evidence that this patient population has difficulty in reading the social situation, difficulty in interpreting what known as theory of mind, interpreting emotional states to other people. And there's some evidence that this might be related to cortical function, although this is pretty nebulous, I've got to say. Much of what I work on is what we don't know about mental illness, and there's probably more that we don't know than we do. And then in terms of mood, I've got an example here from an individual patient. They posted it online. This is a patient who has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. I actually tried to find an academic paper that had this kind of visualization of what it's like to be somebody who has borderline personality disorder, but I couldn't find one that was as illuminating as this. So as you can see from the caption, what this person has done, and I should say they were just at home all day, they weren't out and about, they just spent the day at home, and you can see their mood and their emotional state is fluctuating wildly over the course of the day. So really over minutes, they're swinging from being really very happy to really very unhappy. And this is a real problem for people who have this experience. It's very destabilizing to constantly be, in this sort of state of emotional turmoil. And I have to say, borderline personality disorder and this kind of emotional processing, we know really very little about. And I think it's a real area of a real gap in the literature. So I would really like to encourage anyone who is interested in this area to study it more. And that's something that we're trying to do internally, commission work to understand this better. So these are just a couple of very high level examples. I wasn't going to go into the detail here at all because I want to talk more philosophically about how can we use advances in neuroscience and advances in our understanding of complex emotional and behavioural states to improve treatments for people who have mental health conditions. So one of the big challenges we have at the moment is there is an enormous gulf between the diagnosis and the individual experiences of the person who has that diagnosis. So if you look at the left-hand side here, at the moment, the way that psychiatric illnesses are diagnosed is using one of two big handbooks, the DSM or the ICD-10. These are US and European diagnostic guides, and they're essentially checklist diagnosis. You can have 6 of these, 10 symptoms, and you have experienced them for a certain amount of time. And based on that information, you're given a diagnosis, say, of schizophrenia, major depression, borderline personality disorder, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and so on. But the problem with that is these aren't discrete biological entities. I mean, we know this. We have good evidence that, for example, if you take the genetic basis of any of these conditions, there's huge overlap with the genetic basis of most of the other psychiatric conditions. So these are not neurobiologically distinct entities. Instead, the reality of the situation is that different individuals, irrespective of their diagnosis, will experience different types of symptom profiles, and these can fluctuate over time. So if you look over on the right-hand side here, and what we're calling anhedonia, or abnormalities with reward processing, is seen across a number of different conditions, unsurprisingly, given the lack of sort of concrete neurobiology in these diagnoses. So the implications of this for the patient, I think, are quite significant. So as I've said, these diagnoses don't really mean anything in terms of the underlying neurobiology. As a result, we can't prescribe a given individual a particular treatment regime and know that it's going to work. So people will present with a series of symptoms, they'll get a diagnosis, and then it's kind of trial and error. And that's a real problem because it takes time, if at all, for people to recover and get better. And it's also a problem from a research point of view, because people are given this diagnosis, which we know doesn't map onto neurobiology. It makes actually studying mental health conditions more challenging, because if you take the genomic studies, for example, these large-scale genetic studies will take a group of people with schizophrenia and healthy controls, and they'll compare the two, and major depression with healthy controls, and they'll compare the two. So we're sort of reinforcing this problem by taking that approach. I should say there are some really very good large-scale studies emerging, things like UK Biobank, which are really trying to do a really good deep phenotypic characterization, but this is obviously much more labor intensive than just going and collecting blood from people who have this label or that label. So this is a really big problem for us. So in the last, I would say, over the last decade or so, there's been a move in psychiatric research, generally in mental health research, to move away from these sort of old traditional diagnostic labels towards something a bit more neuroscience focused. And this was really pioneered by the NIMH as part of their research domain criteria, also known as RDoC. And you can see on the right-hand side here what this looks like. So instead of diagnosis, you can see that there are domains, and these are kind of symptom domains, most of which are seen across multiple diagnoses. So we're not talking about schizophrenia, we're talking about changes in arousal, for example. I think the other thing that I really like about the RDoC framework is that it encompasses the notion of time, which is missing at the moment. So patients and individuals, everyone varies from day to day. We all vary in our mood, we vary in our emotional state, and that's not at all captured within the existing diagnostic framework, and it's undoubtedly an important part of these illnesses. And so I think I like this idea. I think there are some issues with it, but broadly speaking, I think this is a better way to proceed. So this is what we're trying to do. As I said at the beginning, I work for Boehringer Ingelheim. I think we're the only pharma company who's exclusively focusing their CNS research on psychiatry rather than neurodegeneration. And really what we're trying to do is to move away from these diagnostic criteria to a more neuroscience-informed approach. So we say that we're RDoC inspired. We're not taking the RDoC framework whole scale, but that's the general idea. What we want to do is to try and treat the symptoms that an individual person experiences with our understanding of neurobiology. And the ultimate aim is to move in the future to a situation where we don't have this trial and error-based approach, that if somebody comes into the clinic, we look at the situation that they're in, their symptom profile, and we think, okay, how can we help this person? How can we help them to get better and achieve a more kind of stable outcome? And I think another key thing is that this is not just going to be pills. People are complex human beings. We're going to need to combine maybe pharmacological interventions with psychotherapy, with social interventions, and so on. And the aim really is to get to a position where we can provide individual support for the patient, whatever it is that they need. This is obviously not easy, clearly. So broadly speaking, this is how we're trying to go. We're trying to use our understanding of neurobiology to come up with new ways of thinking about and treating psychiatric conditions or symptoms and psychiatric conditions in order to improve people's lives. And if you look at the top, you can kind of see the normal pharma approach, which is have an idea, put it in the clinic, see if it works, either license it or don't, depending on what the outcome is. The challenge that we have in mental health and in psychiatry is that we still know very little about the patients themselves, and these are uniquely human conditions. And so I think within this framework, this idea of learning from the patient, reverse translation, in order to better understand the situation and come up with new ideas for treatments is going to be absolutely central. So I think that by using information from patients, it allows us to iterate and refine our approach. So say we develop a medication, it works in some people, it doesn't work in others. Maybe we can use that information to identify either better ways of targeting that treatment or new ways of treating the people for whom it does not work. I think we really need to understand the patient better. I've said this over and over again, and I think the borderline personality disorder example is a really good one, in that the best evidence I could find, the clearest way of showing you that information is going on Reddit and not the academic literature. So I think that's a big gap. By understanding the patient better, that should allow us to understand the underlying neurobiology and the circuitry better, and therefore come up with new and more refined hypotheses. It also should help us to refine our preclinical models. Another big challenge we have in psychiatry is obviously there are no rat models of schizophrenia, there are no rat models of depression. So we have to try and identify ways of using in vivo and in vitro models better, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute, to think, okay, how can we maximize the information that we can get out of a rodent to best predict what might happen in a human? In addition, we're really interested in how you can better measure humans. So a lot of the kind of standard approaches that I used when I was in academia, neuroimaging, all of these detailed kind of longitudinal studies, they're great for understanding patients, but they're really difficult to implement in clinical trials. We can't put everyone in a phase 3 trial in a scanner multiple times. It's just not feasible. So we need to think about what can we do at scale and how can we make that work better. And related to that, in order to get to the point where we can precisely say this is a person who's most likely to benefit from this schedule of treatments, we need to identify biomarkers that we can use to stratify. And I should say, I think about biomarkers in the broadest possible sense, which is essentially anything that can be measured in a human. I don't mean sort of things you measure in blood or, whatever it is. We think about sort of maybe EEG signal or questionnaire data as also potentially being a biomarker. So I just want to give you an exemplar of the kind of approach that we're taking. I would say that moving towards precision psychiatry is very much a journey. It's not something that's going to happen probably within my lifetime, certainly not likely within my working lifetime. But I think there are steps that we can take to move towards that approach. So we currently have a compound that's in phase 2 for post-traumatic stress disorder and major depression. And this really comes from this literature that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, that people with mood disorders and anxiety can show an exaggerated sort of limbic response to threats of various sorts. So this is an example from one of our studies where you show people emotional faces. It wasn't these faces, obviously, no, nicely matched faces. And you can see that if you compare the people with depression to the healthy controls, they show an exaggerated amygdala response. This is good from a translational point of view because this is circuitry that is reasonably well conserved between the human and preclinical species. So obviously we're not going to be showing rats fearful faces and putting them in the fMRI scanner, but this is at least a circuitry that we think is evolutionarily conserved enough that maybe if we measure amygdala activity in a rodent, that might tell us something about the human situation. So what we did was we used a glutamate biosensor to see whether we had any evidence that our compound was reducing amygdala activity in the rat. You can see the drugs have been given at the beginning, and what you can see if you look at the sort of second half of the graph is this is the amygdala glutamate response to restraint stress. So we restrain the animal and you get this big increase in amygdala glutamate, and it's reduced by this compound that we've developed. And so what we were then able to do is to take that compound, give it to humans. We actually used healthy volunteers, and indeed we were able to see that this compound was able to attenuate this amygdala activity in response to fearful faces. So like I say, this is in phase 2 at the moment, so keep your fingers crossed for us. That will be good. So just to give you a sense of how we're thinking and how holistically we're thinking, this is our public pipeline at the moment. I should say there's a lot of really exciting stuff that's in very early phases. And I would say that with all of these projects, we're getting closer to what we would call precision. So our most advanced asset is in phase 3 for cognition in schizophrenia. And this is in itself a kind of novel thing because there are no drugs for cognition in schizophrenia at the moment, despite the fact that it's a really massive problem for individuals who have this diagnosis. Another thing I wanted to flag is that where you see DTX here, these are digital therapeutics. So what we've tried to do is to develop, as I say, this suite of interventions, be it pharmacological alongside other ways of delivering sort of cognitive training or therapy to kind of maximize the benefit to the patients. I believe this digital therapeutic will be the first to have a sort of solid FDA type evidence base. If you go to the App Store on the iPhone or whatever, you'll be able to find hundreds of thousands of apps that will increase your mindfulness and whatever, blah, blah, blah. But none of them have been shown to be effective. So we have this at the moment in what is the equivalent of phase 3 for digital. It's obviously a very different development path. We don't have to worry so much about toxicology, but there are other issues that we need to think about. And so this is a really interesting approach because we have our therapeutic, but then we also have a digital placebo, essentially. And the fascinating thing about me, this is nobody's allowed to know what that placebo is, because unlike a drug trial, if that information got out into the world, that could essentially unblind our trial, which is kind of fascinating, I think. But that should read out next year, so that's something we're really excited about. And then you can see we have earlier stage assets in the process. So really what we're trying to do is to move away from this kind of status quo, where people get a diagnosis and then they're given some medication, and it may or may not help. They might be told, hey, you can have this talking therapy if you wait 6 months, which is not great if you need it right now. And we really want to move away from this sort of tick box diagnosis, which we don't think reflects underlying biology. And the ultimate aim is to move towards a more precise clinical environment where we're providing these kind of holistic solutions, and that might include pharmacology, it might include social prescribing, it might include digital therapeutics, it might include standard therapy, it might include remotely delivered therapy, whatever it is that individual needs. And we hope that ultimately we can get to a place where psychiatry is precise rather than trial and error as it is now. So before I stop, I just want to plug a couple of things. There's QR codes if you're interested in either of these. We will be advertising postdocs shortly, so if you're interested in that, use the upper QR code. As an incentive, this is Lake Constance. It's 45 minutes away from where I live, and it's really very beautiful, so it's a nice place to be where we are. Another thing that I really wanted to flag, and sorry for doing this at a BNA event because it's ECMP related, but as I mentioned, reward processing is core to many different psychiatric diagnoses, but the terminology around it, how you measure it, how you standardize it is really, we think, quite messy. So we have a big group of researchers from industry and academia who are interested in this question, and via the ECMP Experimental Medicine Network, we're trying to get answers to some of these questions. So if that's of interest to you, then the QR code at the bottom you can use to find out more about that, or you can ask me and I will tell you. And that's all I wanted to say, but I'm really happy to take questions. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to take my hat off because it's very hot.
Thank you. We have some time for questions.
I can't see the microphone. Judith.
Hi, fantastic talk and totally empathise with everything you said. I have a question about what are your views on the utility of AI. It hasn't been mentioned very much today in psychiatry.
Yeah, I would say I'm totally on the fence at the moment, if I'm brutally honest. I mean, I think there is. So I think probably the most advanced area at the moment is around patient stratification. So I don't know if you've seen the work coming out of Stanford. I think it's Stanford. This company, Auto Neuroscience, which is taking EEG data and then using it to predict treatment response. Now, that to me is a really interesting thing. However, you have to have collected the data in order to predict the treatment response, which, from our point of view, is not terribly useful because we wouldn't run a phase 3 trial to work out how to give the drugs, who to give the drugs to. So I think if AI can kind of bridge that gap a bit, and I have seen a couple of really early studies where people are using it to answer much more specific questions. So to say, can you identify some kind of neural signature that maybe tells us something about, I don't know, dopamine function in this region? That to me is a much more appealing prospect, because then we could say, okay, we have this thing, this compound or digital therapeutic that we think might modulate that, and that gives us some evidence as to who we might go to with it. I suppose that's the most on my radar use of AI. I mean, we are using machine learning for some existing data sets that are out there, biobank data, for example, or even things like gene expression, but they're very exploratory at the moment. It's not something that we're just like, hey, let's all do AI. I think, it's on the hype curve, right? It's probably fairly near the top, and then we'll see what actually happens. Always the way with these things. But it's an interesting tool that needs to be used in the right manner, I think.
Next.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see who was speaking to.
So I had a question about your use of fMRI in, I think it was a study that you were showing they were looking at faces, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've tried for a couple of decades to get these neuromarkers, biomarkers with using relatively simple stimuli like faces. So do you think that's still a promising way forward, or we need to move to something more naturalistic or something beyond the amygdala, or how do you view this approach of?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would answer that question two different ways, depending on if I was answering it as an academic or as a as a representative farmer. I mean, I think from an academic point of view, absolutely, of course, we need to be working with more naturalistic stimuli, things that are more closer to reality, if you like, I suppose. I guess the thing with my industry hat on, which I just took off because it was way too hot under there, I think often we've kind of touched upon this within the Experimental Medicine Network. It's very interesting that actually often when we use fMRI, we're not using it to understand what faces are doing to the brain here. What we're using it as a way of activating the amygdala to see if we can reduce it. So with that hat on, it matters less actually what the stimulus is, as long as it elicits the response. It's the same restraint stress. We don't think that's, putting an animal in a tube, like, what does that mean? But it does elicit a response that we can then see if we can modulate, essentially, sorry. So yeah, I think about it differently depending on which hat I'm wearing at the time, I suppose.
But it depends on whether the amygdala matters, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, in and of itself, we're not so fussed about what the amygdala is doing. It's just, is this a proxy for a later clinical response? So where we would use things like fMRI or, more labor-intensive type approaches is for proof of, early proof that maybe this is going to work in the clinic before we dive into a big phase 2 trial.
So we have time for 2 short questions.
So it's both welcome and refreshing to hear about new approaches to the treatment of psychiatric conditions. Could you tell us a bit more about the digital therapeutic you talked about?
Can I tell you? So we actually have 2 in development at the moment. The one that I showed you is more focused on cognition. So I can't go into too much detail, like I say, firstly, because I don't know what the placebo is. I think there's like 2 people in the company that actually know what the placebo is. But broadly speaking, it's a sort of cognitive training approach. The kind of problems that, say, somebody with schizophrenia will have is the sort of activities of daily living, like going to the shop, buying what they needed to buy, getting on the right bus, all those sorts of things. And so this digital therapeutic is designed to help with that, essentially.
So it's not CBT based?
No, this one is not, no.
Hi,
Oh, hi, sorry.
I know you mentioned that it's not, like you just mentioned that it's not just drug therapies and other therapies, but I was just thinking if you're directly addressing those cross-diagnostic phenotypes, is there a risk of drug interactions? So, for example, with only one DSM condition, there might be like 5 criteria. So if you're going to address those with drugs, you've got 5 pills. So
they're already taking 5 pills.
Yeah,
That's the problem.
So there's already a case with that.
Yeah.
Toxicology with drug interactions. Does this make it better or worse, or does it not really impact that at all?
I mean, obviously, we have to test this. It's part of the standard development pathway. I mean, I would say, as I say, it's, at the moment, your average schizophrenia patient will be taking a handful of pills that has been prescribed to them over time by a series of clinicians, and polypharmacy is absolutely the norm. So I suppose, of course, it's something we're mindful of, but it's already a problem. So I'm not sure it will be a worse problem. It'll just be a different set of drugs that are given currently, I think. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk, especially the idea of moving into the domains rather than into the diagnosis, especially based on that. Have you look also in what could it be done for the population who have not been diagnosed? Because I think if you look into these 5 domains, most likely, depending on different situations, ways in life, people are going through the 5 domains and they could be benefit. And I think one of the issues that we're currently having these days is that people who not necessarily have a diagnosis, they are also suffering of 5 of them, right? Is that something that you are looking, especially if you are covering no pharmaceutical or no pills? And when you're going to pills, then there is an ethical issue. What about the other? Is something that had been covered, research from the lab perspective?
I mean, the short answer is no. We're not at the moment developing any medications for people who aren't ill by definition, because we have to be addressing a clinical need. Now, that being said, of course, all psychiatric phenotypes of any nature are on a continuum. There's no fallacy that, this person is well and this person is ill. It's just a nonsense. Essentially, there's pretty decent evidence that there's a not inconsiderable proportion of the healthy population who have sort of subpsychotic experiences. Essentially, to end up with a diagnosis, you have to either become a danger to yourself or others, and that's when you get medical care. So I think, there is an ethical issue around misuse of, say, a cognitive enhancer, but this is already happening, right? I mean, modafinil is used by students who are revising. So I think it's something that we need to tackle actually as a field and say, how are we going to deal with this? Because it's not actually something that a company can do by itself. It is a sort of field-wide issue. Now, I think what's interesting is that, if I understood you right, you kind of intimated that would be an ethical concern for a pill, but maybe not for a digital therapeutic. I'm not sure I would see the distinction between those two things to a certain extent. I mean, presumably all of these things that we do, whether they're pharmacological or therapy, they're doing something to the brain, and that's presumably how they're working, unless of course they're affecting the gut. I fully appreciate that, but I think this idea that we have that pills are bad and therapy is somehow pure, it's probably a bit of a nonsense. I think we probably need to start moving away from those different categories and just say, as a society, what do we consider to be okay? Is it okay to pop modafinil if you're a surgeon and you're about to do 10 hours of surgery, and not if you're a student studying for an exam? It's a really interesting ethical discussion, but I think we need to have it as a population, not as an individual company.
Terrific, Liz, thank you so much.